Medic is down. The words came through the squad channel in Corporal Drain's voice, flat, stripped of inflection, the way a trained Marine delivered information that might kill someone. Staff Sergeant Kessa Voss heard the words, processed them, and kept her hands exactly where they were, 2 fingers deep in the chest cavity of a Sithrani rifleman named Harl, whose left lung had collapsed 9 minutes ago from a fragment that had punched through his dorsal plating like it was decorative. Which medic, she said, not a question, a demand for data. Torin took a barrage round to the lower torso. He's conscious, but he's not moving. Torin was her second medic, her only other medic. The platoon had deployed with 3 herself, Torin and PFC Shabrin, who had taken a through-and-through to the thigh 40 minutes ago, and was now functioning as a one-legged triage coordinator from behind a shattered retaining wall, sorting casualties by color tags she'd ripped from her own kit. Asha was still working, because humans did not stop working when they were injured. They stopped working when their bodies physically could not perform the next action, and sometimes not even then. Now Torin was down, which meant that on a battlefield stretching 3 kilometers along the Oreth ridgeline, in a sector where 91 coalition personnel were engaged in a fighting withdrawal against a force that outnumbered them roughly 4-1, the only mobile medical provider was Kessa Voss. She sealed the chest tube, locked the flutter valve, and pressed Harl's own hand against the dressing. Hold this, don't move, breathe shallow, left side only. Harl stared at her with eyes that held the wide, dilated panic of a being whose biology had evolved on a temperate garden world, where the largest predator weighed 40 kilograms and conflict was resolved through pigmentation displays. The Sithrani were beautiful in their way, tall, angular, with skin that shifted between jade and copper depending on their emotional state. Harl's skin was cycling rapidly between both, which meant his autonomic system was caught between fight and flee and couldn't commit to either. You're going to be fine, Voss said. She did not say it with warmth. She said it with the same calibrated certainty she used when reading vital signs aloud. A fact stated for the record. Keep your hand on the dressing. Evac is 40 minutes out. 40 minutes. She'd received the update from command 12 minutes ago. The evacuation corridor was contested. Air assets were committed to the northern sector where a Korvathi armored column had breached the coalition's secondary line. Ground extraction was routing through a canyon system that the Valhari tribal forces had seeded with proximity charges. 40 minutes was optimistic. 60 was realistic. 90 was possible. Her platoon had 91 personnel. 17 were already casualties. 12 of those 17 needed intervention within the next hour, or they would die not from their primary wounds, but from secondary complications that accumulated in bodies not designed for the kind of sustained physiological stress that a 4-hour firefight on a Deathworld-adjacent planet produced. Shock cascades, fluid loss, thermoregulatory failure in species whose homeworlds maintained a constant temperature, and whose bodies had never needed to learn how to cope with the 30-degree thermal swing between the sunlit ridgeline and the shadowed ravine below. Humans coped with thermal swings because Earth threw 30-degree differentials at them between morning and afternoon. Humans coped with fluid loss because Earth's evolutionary pressure had selected for organisms that could function at 15% dehydration. Humans coped with shock because the human adrenal system had been designed by a planet that believed the appropriate response to a predator attack was not to shut down but to run faster, fight harder, and figure out the damage later. Kessa Voss was not thinking about any of this. She was thinking about the number 12. 12 casualties who needed her, one of her, 40 minutes at minimum. She pulled the count from memory, the way she always did, not from a datapad, not from a heads-up display, but from the mental triage board she maintained in real time, updated with every report that came through the channel, every scream she cataloged by direction and species, every silence that followed a detonation she tracked by blast radius and proximity to known friendly positions. Casualty 1, Harl, chest tube placed, stable for 30 minutes if he kept pressure. Casualty 2, Corporal Eshani drain, Sithrani shrapnel laceration to the right forelimb, tourniquet applied by drain herself, stable. Casualty 3, Private Torin, human. Barrage round, lower torso, unknown severity, she needed to get to him. Casualty 4, Sergeant Velk, Korvathi, blunt force trauma from a collapsed position, possible spinal compromise, immobilized by his squad but unassessed. Casualties 5 through 8, a cluster near the western fallback point. 2 Sithrani, 1 Chelrani, 1 Korvathi. Reported injuries ranged from fragment wounds to burns from a directed energy weapon the Valhari had deployed in the last 20 minutes, a weapon that superheated the mineral deposits in standard coalition armor plating and turned the armor itself into a contact burn source. The Chelrani's chitinous exoskeleton had partially fused to his chest plate. He was screaming on a frequency that Voss could hear even without the comm channel. Casualties 9 through 12, forward positions along the ridgeline in contact, unable to withdraw to the casualty collection point. She would have to go to them. Drain, status on the western cluster. 2 ambulatory, 2 litter. The Chelrani mosque, he's bad, Sarge. His plate melted into him. We can't pull it off without taking the exoskeleton with it. Don't pull it, irrigate with saline, cool the contact surface. I'll be there in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. She'd calculated the distance, the terrain, the fire she'd have to cross. The direct route from her current position behind the eastern berm to the western fallback point crossed 200 meters of open ground that the Valhari had been raking with suppressive fire for the last hour. The indirect route along the ravine floor, up through the drainage cut, and across the back side of the ridge was 400 meters but covered. She took the indirect route, not because she was afraid of the open ground, because a dead medic saved nobody, and Kessa Voss had long ago learned to calculate her own survival not as a personal concern, but as a variable in the survival equation of everyone around her. Her life was worth exactly what it could do for the next casualty. If she died crossing open ground, 12 people died with her. The math was not complicated. Before she moved, she keyed the channel one more time. Asha, I'm moving to the western cluster. You have Harl. If his chest tube displaces, reseat it. You've done it before. I've done it once in a lab on a mannequin, Asha said. Her voice was tight with pain, but her diction was clean. A human trait. Even injured, even sitting against a wall with a hole through her thigh, Asha communicated with precision because precision was what kept people alive. But yeah, I've got him. Good, I'll check back in 8. The relationship between human medics was something the Coalition's Interspecies Operations Manual described as team-based care continuity, and what Voss privately called the only reason she hadn't lost her mind on 6 deployments across 4 sectors. You trained with your team. You bled with your team. You carried the weight because you knew that when your hands were full and your back was breaking and the next casualty was 200 meters away through hostile fire, there was someone behind you who would pick up the patients you just put down and keep them breathing while you moved. That was the system. Not a piece of equipment, not a protocol, not a doctrine, a person who understood the work and did it beside you. Torin was part of that system. Asha was part of it. Now Torin was a casualty and Asha was immobilized, and the system was Voss, alone, running the math for 12. She moved through the ravine at a pace that would have been classified as a sprint by any non-Deathworld standard, and as a sustained run by human standards. Her medical ruck weighed 19 kilograms. Her plate carrier added another 12. Her weapon, slung across her chest with the muzzle down and the medic's carry ready but not primary, added 4 more. 35 kilograms of additional load on a frame that weighed 68 kilograms unloaded, moving at speed over broken terrain in gravity that was 0.97 standard, which meant that every step she took required the same muscular output as running on Earth minus a marginal reduction that her body barely registered. Humans did not think about gravity. They thought about footing, about the next handhold, about where the weight needed to shift to maintain momentum through a turn. The biomechanical calculations happened below the level of conscious awareness, processed by a nervous system that had spent 3 million years being refined by a planet that punished slow feet with extinction. Other species marveled at human locomotion, the way they marveled at human endurance, as something that should not work, but did, powered by a musculoskeletal architecture that prioritized adaptability over efficiency, and compensated for the inefficiency by simply refusing to stop. She reached the drainage cut in 4 minutes. The ravine floor was littered with debris from the morning's barrage, cracked limestone slabs, twisted sections of communications cable, a Corvathi field pack that had been abandoned with its contents scattered. She stepped over all of it without breaking stride, her feet finding solid ground between the obstacles with the unconscious precision of a species that had evolved running through forests, across riverbeds, over mountain trails. The human foot had 26 bones, 33 joints, and over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, all working in concert to produce a ground contact system that adapted to terrain changes faster than the conscious mind could process them. Other species designed boots with terrain mapping sensors and stabilization actuators. Humans designed boots that stayed out of the way and let the foot do what it had been doing for 3 million years. She pulled herself up the limestone face using handholds that would have been invisible to a species without the human hand's combination of grip strength, tactile sensitivity, and opposable thumb geometry. Her fingers found purchase in cracks that were measured in millimeters. Her forearms burned with the effort. She cataloged the burn, filed it under irrelevant, and kept climbing. Halfway up, a Valhari round struck the rock face 2 meters to her right. The impact sent a spray of limestone chips across her face. A shard caught the corner of her left eye, and for 3 seconds her vision blurred as the tear duct activated and flushed the debris. She held her position on the face with one hand and her feet, blinking rapidly, waiting for the eye to clear. It cleared. She kept climbing. At the top of the drainage cut, she paused for 2 seconds, not to rest, to update the mental triage board with what she could see from the elevated position. The battlefield spread below her like a surgeon's nightmare. The Oreth ridgeline ran roughly east-west, a spine of fractured limestone and compacted mineral soil that rose 40 meters above the valley floor. The coalition had occupied the ridgeline at dawn, establishing fighting positions along its southern face with clear fields of fire into the valley below. The plan had been straightforward: hold the ridge until the armored column from Firebase Tessara arrived to relieve them. The armored column was not coming. It had been diverted to the northern breach 3 hours ago, and the relief timeline had been pushed from 4 hours to undefined. The Valhari had attacked from the valley floor at mid-morning, which was tactically conventional, and from the reverse slope at noon, which was not. The reverse slope assault had been executed by Valhari tribal assault troops, tall, broad, covered in overlapping plates of natural bone armor that their species grew from adolescence and augmented with riveted metal reinforcement. The Valhari were Category 9 heavy gravity origin, evolved on a world where the atmospheric density was 1.4 standard, and the ground shook with seismic activity roughly once every 72 hours. They were built for impact. Their bone-plated bodies could absorb kinetic energy that would shatter a Cithrani, and their four-toed feet gripped broken terrain, with a stability that came from a species whose planet had never offered stable ground. The reverse slope assault had fractured the coalition's line in 2 places. The western fracture was where the casualty cluster was. The eastern fracture was where Torin had gone down. Voss took stock. From her position she could see the western fallback point, a shallow depression behind a limestone shelf where Drain had consolidated the wounded. She could see the shapes of bodies, some moving, some not. She could see the dull amber of Chelrani exoskeleton and the jade copper shift of Cithrani skin. She could see Mosk. because Mosk was the one whose armor had fused to his chest, and whose screaming had dropped to a low, continuous keen that carried across the ridge like something mechanical. She could also see the Valhari, 2 fire teams, 6 fighters each, advancing along the reverse slope in a bounding overwatch pattern that suggested professional training. Their bone-plated bodies caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in dull white flashes. They carried directed energy projectors, the same weapons that had melted Mosk's armor, and short-range kinetic accelerators designed for the close quarters fighting their species preferred. The Valhari did not like ranged combat. Their homeworld's dense atmosphere degraded energy weapons at distance and scattered ballistic trajectories beyond 300 meters. They fought close because their biology rewarded close fighting. Bone armor absorbed impacts, dense musculature powered through resistance, and their pain response was muted by a neurochemical system that flooded their bloodstream with analgesic compounds at the first sign of tissue damage. They were hard to stop. Individually, a Valhari tribal fighter was a problem. In groups, they were a crisis. 12 of them advancing on a position held by wounded coalition personnel, and 1 functional fire team was not a crisis. It was a countdown. She keyed the squad channel. Drain, you have Valhari inbound on the reverse slope. 2 fire teams, bounding overwatch, bearing 270 relative to your position. Estimate contact in 6 minutes. Copy, we see them. Sarge, we're short. Kel's team has 4 shooters and half a magazine each. I've got 2 ambulatory casualties who can hold a weapon and 4 who can't hold anything. Hold what you have. I'm 90 seconds out. She descended the backside of the drainage cut at a controlled slide, her boots carving grooves in the mineral soil, her center of gravity low, her medical ruck riding high on her back where it wouldn't shift her balance point. At the bottom, she crossed 30 meters of exposed ground in a dead sprint that lasted 11 seconds. 3 rounds from a Valhari kinetic accelerator passed close enough for her to hear the displacement crack, the sharp, flat sound of a projectile moving faster than the local speed of sound in an atmosphere that was slightly thinner than Earth's. She did not flinch. Flinching was a reflex she had trained out of herself at the age of 19, during combat medic qualification at Camp Harada, where the instructors had fired live rounds over the crawl lanes, because they believed that a medic who flinched under fire would hesitate under fire, and a medic who hesitated under fire killed patients. She reached the fallback point and dropped behind the limestone shelf without breaking stride. Drain was their Sithrani, tall, jade-skinned, her right forelimb bound tight against her body with a field tourniquet that Voss noted with professional approval had been tied correctly. Next to Drain, Mosk. She knelt beside the Chelrani and assessed. The directed energy weapon had superheated the anterior section of his chest plate. The ceramic composite material had reached a temperature sufficient to partially melt the interface between the plate and the Chelrani's chitinous exoskeleton, creating a fused bond across roughly 30 square centimeters of his ventral surface. The chitin beneath the fusion point was charred. The underlying tissue was burned to second-degree depth across most of the contact area and degree in 2 spots, where the plate's thermal conductors had channeled concentrated heat. Mosk's compound eyes were glazed. His mandibles clicked in a pattern that Voss recognized as the Chelrani distress vocalization, involuntary, rhythmic, the equivalent of a human moan. His vital signs, read from the medical scanner she pressed against the unburned section of his thorax, showed elevated cardiac rhythm, dropping fluid pressure, and the early stages of systemic inflammatory response. Mosk, I'm Sergeant Voss. I'm going to cool the burn and separate the plate. It's going to hurt, but you need to stay still. The Chelrani's mandibles clicked faster. He didn't speak. He might not have been able to. Voss worked. She irrigated the fusion point with chilled saline from a squeeze bottle, watching the temperature differential create a visible steam plume as the coolant hit the overheated ceramic. She worked the edges of the fused plate with a surgical separator, a flat, thin-bladed instrument designed for exactly this kind of trauma, because the coalition had learned from previous engagements with directed energy weapons that armor fusion was a predictable injury pattern, and had designed tools to address it. The separator slid between the plate and the chitin with a sound like tearing paper. Mosk's body convulsed. Voss pressed her forearm across his thorax to hold him flat, using body weight rather than hand strength, because she needed her hands for the instrument. The plate came free. Beneath it, the burn was worse than the scanner had suggested, degree across 60% of the contact area. The chitin was compromised, cracked, peeling, exposing the pale tissue beneath. In a Chelrani, the exoskeleton served the same structural function as a human ribcage. A compromised exoskeleton meant a compromised body wall. Mosk was one impact away from an open thoracic cavity. She dressed the burn, applied a synthetic chitin patch from her kit, a flexible polymer sheet impregnated with antimicrobial compounds that bonded to damaged exoskeleton and provided temporary structural support, and taped it with pressure wraps that she pulled tight enough to maintain wall integrity without restricting the Chelrani's already labored breathing. Done. Don't roll onto your front. Don't take impacts to the chest. If the patch cracks, hold it with your hands and call for me. 3 minutes. She'd spent 3 minutes on Mosk. The Valhari were 3 minutes closer. She moved to the next casualty. Cithrani female, Private Kelly's. Fragment wound to the dorsal surface between the shoulder blades. The fragment had lodged in the subcutaneous layer without penetrating the body cavity, but the wound was bleeding freely. Cithrani blood was thin, copper-based, and did not clot as efficiently as human blood. The species had evolved on a world where significant wounds were rare because significant predators were rare. Their hemostatic system was adequate for minor injuries and catastrophically inadequate for anything else. Voss packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, a human-designed product that worked by activating a chemical clotting cascade on contact with any fluid, regardless of its biochemistry. The gauze had been developed on Earth for battlefield use with human casualties, and had subsequently been adapted for interspecies application. When the Coalition realized that humans were not the only species that bled on battlefields, but were apparently the only species that had spent 4,000 years developing ways to stop the bleeding. Kelly's gasped when the gauze went in. The chemical activation was exothermic. It burned. Voss held the gauze in place with one hand and checked the wound's margins with the other, feeling for additional fragments by touch because the scanner was faster, but her fingers were more accurate for subcutaneous foreign bodies. She found a second fragment, 3 centimeters from the primary wound, lodged against the scapular equivalent. She extracted it with forceps, packed the secondary wound, and wrapped the dressing tight. You're stable. Stay behind cover. 2 minutes on Kelly's. 1 minute remaining before the Valhari reached effective engagement range. I have 2 full magazines, Voss said. She unclipped her weapon from the medic's carry and checked the charge on the housing. Full. 60 rounds, standard kinetic penetrators. Where's Kel? 30 meters north, behind the secondary shelf. He's got sightlines on the approach, but his people are shaky. They've been taking fire for 2 hours and they know they're short on ammunition. Tell Kel to hold fire until I start shooting. Concentrated fire on the lead element. The Valhari advance in pairs. If you drop the front pair, the rear pairs will hesitate. Their doctrine calls it recalibration. It lasts about 4 seconds. That's when you shift to the second pair. Drain stared at her. The Cithrani's copper jade skin had gone to a flat, neutral tone, the color of controlled fear. You know their doctrine. I studied it, on the transport. It was a long flight. Voss checked her weapon's safety, released it, settled the stock against her shoulder. The weight was familiar. 7 years of carrying this platform through training ranges and combat zones and field hospitals where the weapon sat beside her medical ruck, because in a coalition deployment, being a medic did not mean being unarmed. It meant being armed and also being the person who put people back together after the arms were used. The dual function was uniquely human. Other species separated their medical personnel from their combat personnel because their psychological architecture could not reconcile the two roles. Humans reconciled them because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history being both the thing that healed and the thing that killed, and saw no contradiction in holding a suture needle in one hand and a weapon in the other. Voss looked at Drain. How many rounds does Kell's team have total, including the ambulatory casualties? Drain ran the count. 40, maybe 45. Mixed calibers. 2 of Kell's shooters are running Cthrani light carbines low penetration against bone armor. The other 2 have Corvathi assault platforms they scavenged from the dead. Those'll punch through if they hit the gaps. And the ambulatory casualties. The Corvathi with the wrapped forearms has a full sidearm magazine. The Cthrani with the laceration Eshani, the one I treated, she's got a carbine with half a charge. 50 rounds generously. Against 12 bone-armored fighters who were closing at a steady walk, confident in their mass, their plating, their numbers. The arithmetic was brutal, but arithmetic was Voss's language. She dealt in numbers all day, fluid volumes, dosage calculations, blood loss rates, tourniquet times. The numbers here were just applied to a different kind of problem. She moved to a position at the northern edge of the fallback point, behind a slab of limestone that gave her a supported firing position with a clear lane down the reverse slope. The Valhari were visible now, 12 figures moving in their characteristic low, heavy gait, bone plates, catching the afternoon light, weapons held at the ready. They moved with the unhurried confidence of a species that knew it was harder to kill than anything it was likely to encounter. They had not encountered Kessa Voss. She settled behind her weapon, pressed her cheek to the stock, and let her breathing slow to the long, shallow rhythm that human marksmen used to create a stable firing platform from the chaos of a body that was simultaneously managing heartbeat, respiration, muscle tension, and adrenaline. The reticle steadied. Her pulse was 92, elevated by the sprint, but already dropping because the human cardiovascular system was designed to recover from exertion while still performing complex motor tasks. No other species in the coalition could do this. The Corvathi needed 4 minutes of rest before their cardiac rhythm stabilized enough for precision work. The Cthrani needed 6. Humans needed about 15 seconds. She waited until the lead pair reached the open ground between 2 limestone outcrops. No cover for 12 meters. The lead fighter was the largest of the group, broad, heavy, his bone armor augmented with riveted steel plates across the chest and shoulders. A veteran, based on the scarring visible even at this distance. He carried his directed energy projector in a low, ready position, its emitter aperture tracking the ridgeline ahead of him. Voss put the first round through the gap between his neck plates and his chest armor. The gap was 4 centimeters wide. She hit it from 140 meters. The round was a standard 6.2 kinetic penetrator, a small, dense projectile that relied on velocity rather than mass to defeat armor. Against the Valhari's bone plating, a body shot would have been partially absorbed. Against the gap in the plating, the round passed through muscle tissue, transected the carotid equivalent artery, and continued into the thoracic cavity. The lead fighter went down. Not dramatically, the Valhari did not collapse the way lighter species did. He went to one knee first, then the other, then forward onto his chest plates with the slow, grinding deliberateness of something too heavy to fall quickly. His partner, 4 meters behind, did what Valhari doctrine prescribed. He stopped, assessed, and began scanning for the firing position. The 4 seconds of recalibration. Voss shifted to the second fighter and put a round through his left eye socket. The Valhari eye was deeply recessed behind a brow ridge of solid bone, which made it a difficult target. Difficult was not the same as impossible. The round entered the orbital cavity, and the fighter dropped without completing his scan. Kell now. Second pair center mass concentrated fire. Kell's team opened up. 40 rounds of mixed caliber fire poured into the second pair of advancing fighters. Against bone armor, most of the rounds were partially defeated, absorbed by the dense plating, deflected by the riveted reinforcement, reduced from lethal to painful. But 40 rounds from 4 directions concentrated on 2 targets meant that some rounds found gaps, and the gaps were where the damage happened. The second pair went down in a ragged sequence, one folding sideways, the other staggering backward and sitting down heavily against a rock, with the look of someone who had just realized that the situation had changed categories. 4 down, 8 remaining. The 8 did what Voss had predicted. They stopped, recalibrated. The forward momentum died as the surviving fighters assessed a threat that was not supposed to exist. Their intelligence had told them the western position was held by wounded personnel and a depleted fire team. Wounded personnel and a depleted fire team did not produce precision marksmanship at 140 meters targeting the structural gaps in Valhari armor. Something was wrong with their picture, and Valhari doctrine required them to identify the error before committing. The recalibration bought time. Time was what Voss needed. She checked her mental board. Mosque, patched. Kelly's, packed and stable. The remaining 2 in the western cluster, a Thrani with a superficial laceration who was already ambulatory, and a Korvathi private with fragment burns across both forearms. She treated them in 90 seconds. The Korvathi's burns were painful but not structural. She debrided the charred scale tissue, applied burn gel, and wrapped both forearms in compression dressings that would protect the damaged surfaces and still allow the Korvathi to hold a weapon if it came to that. "Can you shoot?" she asked him. The Korvathi looked at his wrapped forearms, flexed his claws experimentally, winced. "It'll hurt." "Everything hurts. Can you shoot?" "Yes." "Then you're on the perimeter, tell Kell." 8 casualties treated, 4 remaining. The clock in her head kept running 32 minutes to evac maybe, if the corridor cleared, if the air assets finished in the north, if nothing else went wrong. She did not trust maybe. She planned for not yet. "Drain, I'm moving to the eastern fracture to get Torin. Hold this position. If the Valhari resume their advance, use Kell's remaining ammunition in concentrated bursts on the gaps. Neck, eyes, joint articulations. Don't waste rounds on the plates. Sarge, you can't cross to the eastern fracture alone. That's 300 meters of contested ground." "I'm not asking permission, Corporal. I'm informing you of my movement." She didn't wait for a response. She was already moving before the last word left her mouth, because words and motion were parallel processes in a human brain, and she could plan the next sentence while executing the current step and updating the mental triage board simultaneously. Multitasking was another human trait that other species found unsettling, not because humans were uniquely capable of dividing attention, but because they were uniquely capable of maintaining quality across the divided streams. A Thrani who tried to run and plan simultaneously would degrade at both. A human who tried it would run slightly less fast and plan slightly less thoroughly, but would still outperform most species at both tasks done individually. The ground between the western fallback point and the eastern fracture was the worst terrain on the ridge: broken limestone, shallow craters from the morning's barrage, loose shale that shifted underfoot, and intermittent fire from Valhari positions in the valley below. Voss covered it at a pace that split the difference between speed and caution, using the terrain's contours the way a human body was designed to use terrain, reading the ground through proprioceptive feedback, adjusting stride length and foot placement in real time, maintaining forward momentum through obstacles that would have forced a Korvathi to stop and assess, and a Thrani to detour entirely. She passed the body of a Korvathi soldier on the way, dead, Kinetic impact to the head, the skull caved inward above the right eye. She checked his ammunition pouches empty and moved on. She checked his medical kit too, out of habit. It was intact. She took the 2 hemostatic dressings and the single tourniquet from it, adding them to her own diminishing supplies. On a battlefield, the dead were logistics nodes. She did not feel guilt about this. The dead did not need hemostatic dressings. The living did. She passed a fighting position where 2 Cithrani were still firing, their light carbines cycling with the thin, high-pitched report that marked Cithrani weaponry. One of them was bleeding from a cut above his brow ridge, a superficial wound that was leaking copper-green Cithrani blood into his left eye and compromising his aim. Without stopping, Voss pulled a wound closure strip from the external pouch of her ruck, slapped it across the cut as she passed, and pressed it sealed with her thumb. The strip bonded to the skin on contact. The bleeding stopped. The Cithrani blinked, startled, and readjusted his aim. "Any casualties in your position?" "Not anymore, Sergeant." She kept moving. The eastern fracture came into view, a section of the ridgeline where the Valhari reverse slope assault had punched through the coalition's line and then been pushed back by a counterattack that had cost the defenders more than they could afford. The ground was churned. Bodies from both sides lay in the attitudes of their deaths, the Valhari in their heavy, static sprawl, the Cithrani in their angular collapse, the single Corvathi face down with his arms extended as if reaching for something. Torin was behind a shattered section of retaining wall that had been part of a pre-war agricultural terrace. He was on his back, one hand pressed against his abdomen, the other holding his sidearm in a grip that was too tight. His face was gray, not the gray of fear, the gray of blood loss. "Torin Kessa, let me see it." He moved his hand. The barrage round had entered below the left side of his plate carrier, through the soft armor panel that covered the lateral abdomen. Entry wound 4 centimeters, no visible exit wound. The soft armor's backing material was shredded around the entry point, which meant the round had carried fragmentation from the armor itself into the wound channel. Internal bleeding was certain. The amount was the variable. She cut the soft armor panel away with her trauma shears and exposed the wound, irrigated with saline. Probed with her fingers gently, because gentleness mattered even when speed mattered more. Because a medic who caused additional injury in the name of speed was not a medic, she was a liability. The round had tracked laterally through the abdominal wall, chewing muscle tissue and nicking what felt like the lower margin of the spleen. There was blood in the abdomen. She could feel the fluid warmth when she pressed on the upper quadrant. Not arterial, not yet. "You're bleeding internally, but it's venous, not arterial. I can pack the wound and stabilize you, but you need surgical intervention within 90 minutes. "Evac's 40 minutes out," Torin said. His voice was thin but steady. "Evac was 40 minutes out 20 minutes ago. It might be 40 minutes from now. It might be 60. So I might die." "You're not going to die. I'm going to pack this wound, give you a volume expander, and carry you back to the casualty collection point where a shack can monitor your vitals while I finish treating the others." "Carry me?" Torin looked at her. He was 30 kilograms heavier than she was, plus his gear. "Kessa, the terrain." "I know the terrain, I just crossed it." She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, applied a pressure dressing, and connected a volume expander to the IV port she placed in the antecubital vein of his left arm, the one that wasn't holding the sidearm. She hung the fluid bag from a carabiner on her plate carrier's shoulder strap so it would feed by gravity while she moved. Then she pulled him up. The physics were straightforward. Torin weighed 89 kilograms in his gear. Voss weighed 68 in hers, plus the 19-kilogram medical ruck. She was lifting and carrying a total system mass of approximately 176 kilograms across 300 meters of broken terrain under intermittent fire. Humans had a phrase for this. They called it buddy carry. The term was clinical, understated, the way humans understated everything physical. A buddy carry was a technique taught in the first week of combat medic training, refined over years of practice, and rooted in a biomechanical truth that other species found difficult to accept. Human skeletal muscle, driven by a cardiovascular system designed for persistence rather than power, could sustain loads that exceeded the carrier's own body weight for distances that exceeded any rational engineering prediction. The secret was not strength. The secret was efficiency, the ability to convert metabolic energy into sustained mechanical output without the catastrophic fatigue response that limited stronger species to short bursts. A Corvathi could lift more. A Valhari could carry more. But neither could carry another being across 300 meters of broken terrain, while simultaneously maintaining situational awareness, managing an IV drip, and keeping a mental triage board updated with 12 active casualties. She moved. Torin tried to say something. She felt his mouth open against her shoulder, the vibration of speech starting and then stopping. He knew better. A combat medic in transit was not a conversational partner. She was a vehicle, a life support platform, a 68-kilogram delivery system designed to get him from here to there alive. Anything he said would cost him metabolic energy he could not spare and would cost her attentional bandwidth she could not afford. His weight settled across her shoulders, distributed in the fireman's carry position with his torso across her back and his arms secured across her chest. The medical ruck rode low against her lumbar spine, its weight pulling her center of gravity backward, which she compensated for by leaning forward at the hips, a postural adjustment so automatic that her conscious mind never registered it. The first 100 meters were the hardest because they crossed the churned ground of the eastern fracture, where every step required her to navigate around debris and bodies while carrying a load that would have pinned a Sithrani to the ground. Her boots found solid footing on surfaces that shifted and crumbled, guided by the proprioceptive system that had kept her species alive on a planet where the ground itself was hostile volcanic terrain, river crossings, ice fields, jungle floors covered in roots and deadfall. Earth had spent 4 billion years designing surfaces that were difficult to walk on, and humans had spent 3 million years learning to walk on all of them. At the 100-meter mark, Valhari fire raked the ridgeline ahead of her. 3 rounds spaced, the heavy crack of kinetic accelerators firing from the valley floor. She dropped behind a limestone outcrop, lowering Torin as carefully as the situation allowed, checking the IV line still flowing and scanning the source of fire. VOS to drain. Status on the western Valhari. They pulled back, recalibrated and withdrew to the valley floor after Kell's team dropped 2 more. We're holding. A pause. When Drain spoke again, her voice had changed, the flat tactical register had cracked and something rower was showing through. But Sarge Velk is getting worse. His spine, I think it's compromised. He can't feel his hind legs. He's asking for you. Sergeant Velk, Casualty 4, Corvathi, blunt force trauma, suspected spinal injury. He had been immobilized by his squad when the reverse slope assault collapsed his fighting position, and he'd been waiting for her ever since. Waiting was the hardest part of battlefield medicine, not for the medic, who was always moving, but for the casualty who lay still and listened to the sounds of a fight they could not influence and a rescue they could not see. Velk had been lying on that makeshift backboard for over an hour now, feeling the sensation drain from his legs by degrees, wondering if each lost increment was the last one that would come back. The Corvathi were stoic by temperament. Their evolutionary heritage had selected for calm under physical duress, but stoicism had limits, and a warrior who could not feel his legs was brushing against those limits. Copy, I'm 90 seconds from the collection point with Torin. I'll assess Velk next. She lifted Torin again, resumed movement. The second 100 meters were easier because the terrain leveled into the central portion of the ridge, where the limestone was solid and the footing was reliable. She covered it in 3 minutes, her breathing deep and rhythmic, her heart rate steady at 104, her muscles operating in the sustained output mode that human physiology defaulted to under load, not sprinting, not resting, but grinding forward at a pace that could be maintained for hours if necessary. Not comfortable, not painless, but sustainable, which was the only metric that mattered. The final 100 meters brought her back to the central casualty collection point, a shallow draw behind the ridgeline's crest where Ashab Bryn had established the triage station. Ashab was sitting against a rock with her injured leg extended, a tourniquet above the wound site, her datapad propped against her knee displaying the vital signs of every tagged casualty in the platoon. She looked up when Voss appeared. Torin, abdominal, venous bleed, packed and pressurized, volume expander running. He needs surgical in 60 minutes. Got him. Ashad took the handoff with the economy of a professional who had done this before and would do it again and did not waste time on expressions of concern. She checked Torin's vitals, adjusted the IV flow rate and nodded. Go. Voss went. To Velk, who was lying on his side where his squad had immobilized him, his massive Korvathi frame strapped to a makeshift backboard constructed from weapon components and binding straps. Velk was conscious, but his breathing was wrong, shallow, rapid, the labored rhythm of a diaphragm working without the assistance of the lower intercostal muscles that should have been helping it. She assessed, palpated the spine, found the injury a compression fracture at the thoracolumbar junction, the vertebral body partially collapsed, the spinal cord compromised but not severed. She could feel the misalignment through Velk's thick-scaled hide. The Korvathi's spinal architecture was different from a human's, more robust, more heavily armored with natural bone plating, but also less flexible. A human spine could tolerate partial compression through the shock-absorbing properties of its intervertebral discs. A Korvathi spine, rigid and load-bearing, either held or broke. Velk's had broken, but the cord was intact. She could confirm this by the Korvathi's ability to move his forelimbs and by the presence of involuntary spinal reflexes in his hind legs when she stimulated the plantar surfaces. The paralysis was from swelling, not transection. Swelling could be managed. Transection could not. Velk, I'm going to administer an anti-inflammatory directly to the spinal canal. It will reduce the swelling around the cord. You should recover sensation in your legs within 30 to 40 minutes. Will I walk? You'll walk. The cord is bruised, not cut, but you stay on the board until evac arrives. No movement. If that fracture shifts, the prognosis changes. She administered the injection, a targeted corticosteroid compound delivered via a spinal needle that she guided by palpation. Because the field scanner's resolution was insufficient for Korvathi spinal anatomy and her fingers were, as always, the more precise instrument. Velk's body tensed when the needle entered the spinal space. She held him steady with her free hand, the pressure firm, the way she held every patient with the controlled force of someone who understood that gentleness and weakness were not the same thing. Velk's breathing changed, slower, the tension in his forelimbs released by a fraction. She didn't tell him it was working yet because the medication needed 10 minutes to take full effect and she would not give a patient false timelines. What she said was, "Stay flat, I'll check you in 15. His clawed hand caught her wrist as she started to rise. The grip was strong. Korvathi grip strength exceeded human by a factor of 3, but he held her with the care of someone who knew exactly how much force was too much. "Sergeant, thank you." She looked at his hand on her wrist, then at his face. The vertical pupils were steady now, not darting. "Save the thanks for when you walk off the transport." Done. She noted the time. 41 minutes since the first casualty report. 10 casualties treated. 2 remaining at the forward positions along the ridgeline, in contact, unable to withdraw. Plus Torin, who was now at the collection point with a shab but still needed monitoring. Drain, I need a path to the forward positions. Who's still engaged? 3rd Squad, Sergeant Orath's team. They're pinned at the ridgeline crest, 200 meters east. They've got 2 casualties, one Cithrani with burns, one Corvathi with a lower extremity amputation. Field tourniquet applied, but it's slipping. A slipping tourniquet on an amputation was a time-critical emergency. The Corvathi's arterial system operated at higher pressure than a human's, which meant that a tourniquet failure would result in rapid exsanguination minutes, not the tens of minutes a human might survive. I'm moving to 3rd Squad. Tell Oreth I'm coming through his position from the south, and I need covering fire for the last 50 meters. She moved again, up the back slope of the ridge, along a goat trail that wasn't a goat trail because this planet had no goats but had something equivalent that had worn a path through the limestone over thousands of generations of moving between the valley and the heights. The trail was narrow, exposed on the eastern side to fire from the valley, and steep enough that her calves burned with lactic acid buildup that she acknowledged and dismissed. Oreth's position was a cluster of fighting holes dug into the ridgeline crest, reinforced with stacked limestone and scavenged armor plating. The squad had been in continuous contact for 3 hours. Their faces showed it, the flat, exhausted expressions of soldiers who had passed through fear and into the mechanical state beyond it, where the body continued to function not because of will, but because the alternative was to stop functioning, and stopping was not an option their training allowed. A Cithrani private, the burn casualty, was propped against the position's rear wall with 2nd-degree thermal damage across his left arm and shoulder, where the directed energy weapon had caught the edge of his plate carrier. The burn pattern was consistent with a glancing hit rather than a direct strike, which meant the tissue damage was painful but not structural. Voss treated him first because he was the faster fix: irrigate, debride, apply burn gel, wrap with a compression dressing that would protect the damaged skin and prevent further contamination from the limestone dust that coated everything on the ridge. 2 minutes. The Cithrani stopped the low keening he hadn't realized he was making. His skin shifted from the ashen gray of pain to a muted jade. The Corvathi with the amputation was Private Delk. His right lower leg was gone below the knee, severed by a Valhari kinetic round that had struck the limb at an angle that converted the projectile's energy into a shearing force the Corvathi's dense bone could not absorb. The tourniquet, a standard coalition model designed for Cithrani-sized limbs, was too narrow for the Corvathi's thigh. It had been over-tightened to compensate, and was now cutting into the scaled hide, creating a secondary injury that was undermining the compression it was supposed to provide. Voss replaced it. She used a broadband tourniquet from her kit, a human-designed model with an adjustable width that could accommodate limb diameters from human to Corvathi, and applied it 6 centimeters above the amputation site, tightening it in measured increments until the arterial flow stopped. The bleeding had already cost Delk roughly 800 milliliters, based on the staining pattern on the ground and the Corvathi's vital signs. His cardiovascular system was compensating, but the compensation was unstable. She started a volume expander line. While the fluid ran, she kept one hand on Delk's IV regulator, monitoring the drip rate by counting drops against the pulse she felt in his wrist with her other hand. The Corvathi's vital signs were stabilizing cardiac rhythm, slowing from the panic spike, blood pressure holding at the low end of functional. He was going to keep the knee. He was going to keep his life. The tourniquet had been the variable, and the variable was now controlled. Oreth watched her work. The Cithrani sergeant was tall, lean, his jade skin muted to a flat gray-green that meant he was running on fumes. He had been commanding this position for 3 hours under fire, and he had held it because the position needed holding and because, somewhere in the Cithrani's garden world evolutionary heritage, there was enough inherited stubbornness to keep a soldier at his post when every physiological signal told him to run. But the stubbornness was wearing thin. Voss could see it in the micro-tremors of his forelimbs, in the way his eyes tracked too slowly, in the incremental slowing of his command decisions. Oreth was approaching the edge. Sergeant Oreth, Evac is 30 minutes out, maybe less. We need to consolidate. Pull your squad back to the collection point. I'll take rear. I can't leave the crest. If the Valhari push again. The Valhari have pulled their western element back to the valley floor. They lost 6 fighters in the last engagement. Their doctrine requires a command-level decision before re-engaging after losses exceeding 30%. That gives us a window. We use it to consolidate, concentrate our remaining firepower, and hold one position instead of 3. Oreth stared at her. How do you know their loss threshold? Same way I know the tourniquet width for a Corvathi thigh. I studied. She didn't explain further. Explaining was a luxury that consumed time, and time was the currency she was spending to keep 12 people alive. Every second she stood here talking was a second she wasn't treating, moving, assessing, planning. Oreth gave the order. His squad pulled back from the crest, carrying Delk on a makeshift litter, the burn casualty walking with support. Voss moved behind them, walking backward for the first 50 meters, her weapon up, scanning the crest for any sign of Valhari movement. There was none. The recalibration window was holding. At the collection point, Asha had organized the casualties into rows by severity. Red tags Torin, Delk, Mosque in the center where she could monitor them continuously. Yellow tags Velk, Kelly's, the burn casualties, the cluster cases in a semicircle around the reds. Green tags ambulatory wounded who could hold a weapon at the perimeter. 12 casualties, all accounted for, all in one place for the first time since the battle had fractured the platoon across 300 meters of contested ridge. Voss did a final circuit. Every medic learned this in training. You check your work. Not because you don't trust it, she trusted her work the way she trusted her hands, completely and without sentiment, but because the battlefield degraded everything. Dressings shifted. Tourniquets loosened from the micro-vibrations of barrage impacts. IV lines kinked when patients moved, and patients always moved because pain was a restless thing, and the body's instinct was to reposition away from it even when repositioning caused more damage. She checked every dressing, every tourniquet, every IV line, every vital sign. Adjusted Torin's volume expander rate because his blood pressure was stabilizing, and the excess fluid would stress his kidneys. Repositioned Mosque's synthetic chitin patch because the Chelrani had shifted despite her instructions, and the patch's lower edge was peeling. Confirmed Velk's sensation, he could feel pressure on his hind feet now, which meant the anti-inflammatory was working and the swelling was receding. 12 casualties, all alive, all stabilized. The number sat in her mind with the weight of a completed equation. She had started with 12 unknowns, 12 bodies in various states of structural failure, spread across 300 meters of hostile terrain, and she had reduced each unknown to a known quantity. Chest tube, tourniquet, burn patch, spinal injection. Volume expander, hemostatic gauze. The tools changed, but the process was the same. Assess, intervene, stabilize, move to the next. The process was the only thing she trusted absolutely. Not luck, not timing, not the 40-minute evac window that might be 30 or might be 90. The process. She found a spot at the perimeter, between 2 limestone slabs that gave her a firing position covering the southern approach. She checked her weapon, 41 rounds remaining from her original 60. She checked her medical ruck, 3 hemostatic dressings, 1 volume expander bag, half a bottle of saline, 4 synthetic patches, and the spinal needle she'd used on Velk, which she'd cleaned and resheathed because in combat medicine, you did not discard functional equipment regardless of what the sterile procedure manual said. She sat down, her back against the limestone, her weapon across her knees, her eyes on the southern slope. Her body was demanding rest, the deep, bone-level fatigue that accumulated when a human operated at sustained high output for 4 hours while carrying loads, absorbing stress, and making decisions that determined whether other beings lived or died. Her muscles ached. Her feet were hot inside her boots. The scratch on her neck from a ricochet fragment had clotted hours ago and was pulling tight against her skin when she turned her head. She did not rest. She sat at the perimeter because the perimeter needed someone who could shoot accurately at 140 meters and who could cross the distance to any casualty in the collection point in under 10 seconds if a condition changed. She sat there because she was the medic and the perimeter guard and the person who had studied the Valhari's tactical doctrine on a transport flight. Because she believed that understanding the enemy's decision-making was as important as understanding the enemy's biology, and both were part of the job. Drain came to her position. The Cithrani corporal sat down carefully, favoring her injured forelimb, and looked at Voss for a long time before speaking. You carried Torin across 300 meters under fire. Yes. He weighs 89 kilograms in his gear. 87. I dropped his secondary ammunition pouch before lifting him. Drain's skin shifted to a color Voss hadn't seen before, a deep, steady copper that didn't cycle. On a Cithrani, copper was the color of something beyond respect, something closer to the recognition that you were looking at a category of being that your evolutionary heritage had not prepared you to understand. When the Valhari came, the four you dropped, you targeted the gaps in their armor. Their bone plating absorbs kinetic rounds, the gaps don't. It's not complicated. You studied their anatomy, and their doctrine, and their communication protocols, and their field medicine, which is effective for blunt force injuries but inadequate for penetrative trauma. If you want to beat a species, you understand the species. If you want to treat a species, same thing. Drain was quiet. The afternoon sun had moved past its peak and the light on the ridgeline was turning golden, the shadows lengthening across the churned ground. In the valley below, the Valhari had not resumed their advance. The six-fighter loss had exceeded their recalibration threshold. The command element in the valley would be requesting additional forces, assessing, planning. The window was holding. 20 minutes to evac, maybe less. Sergeant Voss. What? The platoon when the reverse slope assault hit, when Torin went down and the line fractured, and the Valhari were advancing on the western position, and there were 12 casualties across 300 meters of contested ground. What did you think? Voss considered the question, not because the answer was complicated, but because the true answer was the kind that made other species uncomfortable. And she had learned through experience that other species' comfort mattered when you needed them to hold a perimeter while you worked. I thought about triage order, who needed me first, who could wait, who needed treatment that only I could provide, and who needed treatment that anyone with basic first aid could manage. I calculated movement times between positions. I assessed the threat axis and determined whether the Valhari advance timeline allowed me to treat the western cluster before contact, or whether I'd need to address the tactical situation first to create the space for medical treatment. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Voss checked her weapons charge housing, still full. The rounds she'd fired had been from the kinetic magazine, not the energy cell. You're asking whether I was afraid. Yes. Fear is a physiological response to perceived threat. My species produces it constantly. We evolved on a planet where the threat environment was continuous and pervasive predators, whether terrain, disease, other humans. Our fear response is always running. We don't eliminate it. We manage it the same way we manage heartbeat and respiration and thermoregulation. It runs in the background. It informs decision-making without controlling it. She paused, looked at Drain directly for the first time since the conversation started. I was afraid the entire time, every second. From the moment Torin went down to right now, sitting here, the fear hasn't stopped. It won't stop until we're off this ridge and the casualties are insurgical. But fear is data, Corporal. It's not a command. The difference between my species and most of the galaxy is that we learned, a very long time ago, that you can be terrified and still do the job. You can be afraid and still carry someone across 300 meters. You can be shaking inside and still put a round through a 4-centimeter gap at 140 meters. She looked back at the southern slope. The job doesn't wait for the fear to stop, so neither do we. Drain's skin stayed copper. She didn't speak again. 17 minutes later, the sound came, the low, resonant thrumming of coalition evacuation transports descending through the afternoon haze. 3 craft, heavy-lift medical configuration, their ventral hulls marked with the green and white medical insignia that was one of the few symbols in the galaxy that every species, including the Valhari, recognized as off-limits. The transports settled on the reverse slope, their downdraft kicking up limestone dust that coated everything in a fine white powder. Voss supervised the loading herself, moving between stretcher teams, verifying that each casualty was secured correctly, that the IV lines were clamped for transport, that the spinal injured Velk was transferred to the surgical craft's immobilization cradle without rotation. Torin went onto the first transport. He looked at her from the stretcher, his face still gray but his eyes clear. "Kessa, save your energy for surgery. You carried me. That's the job." "No," he held her gaze, "that's you." She didn't respond. She turned to Delk's stretcher, checked the tourniquet one final time, confirmed the amputation site was stable, and cleared him for loading. Mosk went next, his mandibles still clicking in the distress pattern, the synthetic chitin patch holding. Kelly's, the burns. The cluster cases. Last was Velk. The Korvathi sergeant had regained full sensation in his hind legs and was arguing that he could walk to the transport under his own power. Voss told him that if he moved his spine before a surgical team confirmed the fracture's stability, she would sedate him and carry him herself. Velk looked at her, all 93 kilograms of him looked at all 68 kilograms of her, and he believed her. He stayed on the board. The transports lifted. The ridgeline went quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of the Korvathi armored column that was, finally, 12 minutes late, grinding its way through the canyon system toward a battle that was already over. Voss sat back down at the perimeter. She still had 41 rounds. She still had the southern approach to cover. The evac had taken the casualties but not the platoon. The remaining effectives were still on the ridge, still holding, still waiting for the relief column. She checked her medical ruck, 3 dressings, 1 fluid bag, half a bottle of saline, the clean spinal needle, enough to keep someone alive for maybe 20 minutes if the next injury was survivable. She rechecked her weapon, scanned the southern slope, calculated the time until the armored column arrived, estimated the Valhari's regroup timeline based on their doctrine, their losses, and the diminishing daylight. The math said the column would arrive before the Valhari re-engaged, probably. The math did not deal in certainties, and Voss did not trust anything that claimed to be certain. So she sat on the ridge, weapon ready, medical ruck open, watching the slope. Drain sat 12 meters to her left. Orath sat 20 meters to her right. The remaining effectives held their positions, their weapons oriented outward, their ammunition counted, their eyes on the terrain. They were tired. They were scared. They were still here. Voss checked the time, checked the slope, checked the ruck. The wind came across the ridge and carried the limestone dust away, and she waited in the golden light for whatever came next, ready for both the wound and the weapon, because on a Deathworld the two were never far apart, and the human who understood that was the one the others wanted on the ridge.